Hey everybody, welcome to week 4. My name is Omid, and we're going to jump right into it. So let me share my screen. This week we're going to be talking about digital ethics and privacy. So a lot of fun stuff, a lot of relevant things that are happening right now. Um, so we're going to go and talk about the implications of it. Okay, sharing my screen now. Got it. Okay, perfect, perfect. So as I mentioned, we are going to be discussing about digital ethics and privacy. So let's go over the agenda. So the agenda for today, we're gonna talk about some BAU activities. We're gonna talk about digital ethics, digital privacy, and then we're gonna talk about deliverables that we have due this upcoming week. So let's jump right into it with the business as usual. For the BAU, we have some of the grades that I done already. So for article review 2, we've had a class average of 92%, which is great. I love the discussions that we're having in our discussion boards. I really appreciate everybody taking the time and reading it and actually responding back to your classmates. So this is great. I love it. Um, in later article review sessions, I might ask you to pull your own article to actually have. So keep your eye out for that. And then I want to also mention that when giving response to your classmates, ensure that you're, providing thought-provoking response, right? Because I've seen some that has these, I like your post, you've done a great job, and we're done, right? So what I'm looking for is actually some thought provoking, right? You can play like devil's advocate, you can question a certain thought process, but we want to make sure that you're engaging and having great conversations with your classmates. So, but overall, article review 2, we have a 92%. Now let's jump right into digital ethics. So give me 1 second. Okay. So, introduction to digital ethics and privacy. So, first, we're going to talk about digital ethics itself, right? So, for this one, um, digital ethics is a crucial field that intercepts between philosophy, technology, and sociology. It addresses the ethical challenges presented by the digital innovations, such as dilemma of surveillance, capitalism, the ethics of AI, automation, and the responsibility of tech companies towards these technologies. It's about ensuring that technology serves humanity in a positive way without infringing on the rights or the dignity. So a lot of this has to include with the fact of how technology companies have so much data on us, and what is our data and what is not our data, right? That's the biggest question right now. Who owns the right to our data? If you ask tech companies, they own it. If you ask us, we own it. So we're gonna dive into some stuff like that. Next, we're going to talk about digital privacy, right? And this kind of goes back into the data that I just mentioned. So the significance of this in the era where personal data is often termed as new oil, right? We talk about new oil because it's such a high commodity right now. And within the vast digital landscapes where every click, every like, every share is tracked, monitored, and placed in a big data platform, privacy becomes much more of a maintenance uh, privacy becomes more of maintaining individual freedom and control over one's digital footprint. So if you have been on the internet for a long time now, you can notice that if you search up your name, multiple searches might come up. Example, if you search on my name, you may see some stuff from when I was back at U of I. You might see some things that relate to Google, some things that relate to Coursera. If you look very, very, very deep, you might find a blog that I made when I was in high school. So a whole bunch of things. Um, and like we have to discuss the implication of the data breaches and unauthorized data sharing, right? So you hear these companies like Target, Facebook, that have these data breaches, right? If you remember a couple years ago, I think before the chips on the debit cards, credit cards, Target had actually a really big data breach where a lot of customers' data was breached and a lot of card information, social security cards were leaked out. So when we think about it, right, what is our digital privacy? How do we ensure that our data is not sent to an unauthorized user? When we think about it, this actually leads to a lot of different things, right? As I mentioned, theft, financial fraud, and erosion of personal privacies. I've known people that have gotten their data stolen and their identity compromised. there's a whole legal thing and a whole legal implementation that they had to go through just to get their data back and to say that I am who I say I am. And why is this important, right? So the importance of how digital ethics and privacy form, it's the backbone of trust in digital world. Without an ethical framework and strong privacy protections, technology risks have become much more invasive, becoming a tool of it, exploitation rather than empowerment. Ethics considerations and privacy reporting allows us to protect not just the legal requirements, but the crucial requirements for building a digital environment that is secure, trustworthy, and inclusive. With any of my tech savvy individuals here, we know that getting onto any site that doesn't have a S at the end of HTTPS or at the end of HTTP are sites that are considered not secure. It doesn't mean it for all sites, right? But usually sites that don't have the secure at the end of the HTTP are sites that we try to stay away from. All right, next, let's talk about some historical context. So let's talk about early internet. As we discussed before in our previous lectures, the internet was actually the original purpose of the internet was actually a tool for academia and military use, where the concept of personal privacy was largely irrelevant because these two areas were using it and it didn't really matter about the individual data. This lack of concern for privacy set a precedence that would later become a challenge for us as the internet grew into a global interconnected network that had a vast reach. This shift from a limited academia-focused network to an abundance platform introducing complex privacy issues as a personal data becomes a valuable commodity for businesses and governments. If you ever look at any social medias, if you ever talk about any sort of concepts or any product, talk about like having any what is this here? So I have my Apple AirPods, right? Talk about AirPods, right? Maybe you'll see an ad for an AirPod on your iPhone, or if you look on Google, or if you go on Facebook, or other platforms like Twitter, Instagram. It's just crazy. Your data, your privacy is so invasive right now. It is absurd. So now let's talk about the privacy evolution, right? So the evolution of privacy by tracing how data was exposed of internet's commercial use and the rise of social media, as I mentioned, have fundamentally changed our relationship with personal data. This era has seen an unprecedented scale of data collection, often with insufficient users' consent, meaning that the users are not consenting to their data being used or understanding of how the data is being used. Long ago, it wasn't until social media platforms finally revealed that their data that they were collecting were being sold to a third party to sell XYZ product. This shift raises significant ethical concerns about consent, data ownership, and the balance between personal privacy and commercial interests. So some milestones in privacy, let's talk about that. One of the biggest ones that you may know about is about Edward Snowden and what we call the Snowden revelations. What the Snowden revelations brought to light the scale and depth of the global surveillance practices done by the NSA, challenging public trust in both governmental and technology companies. The Cambridge Analytica scandal served as a wake-up call about the power use of personal data, influencing in democratic procedures and the need for greater transparency and control over personal data. So if you remember the Cambridge Analytica here in the US was actually one of the companies that had user data about, just affiliations, about personal interests, and this was used to actually manipulate ads for political gain, right? And depending on however you see the story and however it's spent, what we do know is that for this scandal to happen, data was breached, right? And that's what we know for sure. How the data was used is always up for debate, but we know that a lot of personal data was exploited for their own personal gains of companies. And next, we are going to talk about the introduction of the GDPR, which marked a pivotal moment in privacy regulations, establishing stricter guidelines for data protections, granting individuals greater control over their data, and inspiring a similar law worldwide. These events collectively underscore the ongoing tensions between technology advancements and the need for protection on personal data privacy and the ethical standards in the data realm. Next, I want to touch about this one interesting part I just mentioned, the Snowden revelation. And I won't go too deep into it, but I want to call out a few different points. So, what is the Snowden revelations for those that don't know? So, back in June 6th of 2013, The Guardian and the Washington Post published first series of reports putting together form of documents leaked by anonymous source. If you've ever taken I can't remember the name. If you ever taken cryptography with me, we will talk about a certain concept of onions, and then how to actually send out leaked data without being known. But this is what happened in this instant. So the material was exposed under the material that was exposed was actually insinuating that the government ran a surveillance program, meaning that they were monitoring, tapping into cameras and phone lines. It was a program that monitored the communication records of not just criminals or potential threats. This was everybody, all law-abiding citizens, and this was insane when the news broke. So the Guardian and the Washington Post also exposed that the NSA surveillance activities revealed that the collection of cell phone records from civilians and text messages and the tapping of servers in 9 of the major internet companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, under the program called PRISM, to monitor various personal communication. What happened was Edward Snowden revealed this information. He leaked it out to the public, and he was actually charged for this, right? Because this was government property. So he faced charges of various he faced charges having against exposing governmental property and unauthorized communication of classified information. So risking about 30 years in jail, what he did was actually flee the US. First he went to Hong Kong, then Russia, and then just being avoided being extradited back into the States. So if you want to learn more, please look up the Snowden revelations. There are mixed reviews of how this happened and who was to blame and who is in the rights, but take that for yourself and form your own opinion on it. Okay, next we're going to talk about the theoretical foundations, right? So we talk about ethical theories applied. So ethical theories provide a foundation for navigating the complexity of moral landscapes of the digital world. Utilizationism asks us to consider the consequences of our digital policies and technologies. Do they increase the overall well-being? Denouncing ethical pushes us to think about the duties and principles that should guide our digital actions, such as the duty to protect users' data. Other ethics focuses on the quality that defines a good digital civilian and the culturalism of a moral character in an online presence. So what does that all mean? This basically refers to the idea that how should we act online? What information should we put up online? And what does our digital presence represent about us as individuals? Another big topic that goes around, especially in nowadays, is the digital personhood, which explains that this concept is challenging for us to rethink the identity and the rights in an online context. It is about understanding how digital presence through social media profiles, online transactions, and a whole variety of interactions, contributing to our sense of self and entitles certain rights and responsibilities. This leads to the questions about the rights of digital avatars or AI entities and how they intersect with human rights and ethics. Should AI have the same rights as human? Some say no, some say yes. This is all up for debate. I would love to hear what you think about this. Now, implementation of these policies, right? So emphasizing that these are theoretical frameworks that we're just using for our practices now. But the real understanding of this is that we need to have policies in place to protect our data and other types of data, right? Because right now we have this huge giant machine by OpenAI, ChatGPT, that is just harvesting all this information. What rights does that ChatGPT have, right? And what rights do you as individuals have for the data that you've put into ChatGPT? As of now, it may seem like it's irrelevant, that it's not important, or it just doesn't matter. But soon enough, these ideas and these things that we've done will matter in the future. So policies of how to protect data all around is super important. So now we talk about artificial intelligence and the different ethics about this, right? And one of the important things that I want to call out here is AI biases. So AI is not biased inherently, right? Machine learning models are not biased inherently, right? But they can be inherently, they can inherently have prejudgment presence in their training data, right? A blank AI is not racist, right? But it can be trained to be racist, right? And you may say, wow, like there should be safeguards in this, so it doesn't allow it to. But this has been present in our day, right? So leaning to biased decisions, once these AI models and machine learning models are biased, right, it will lean towards a more biased decision and disproportional affects marginalized groups. When we ask ChatGPT certain questions, if it was designed in a biased way, we may get biased responses and we may not even believe it. Early on, when ChatGPT was new on the market in December of 2022, I believe it was, there was a lot of problems with it. It was giving a lot of weird responses. It was very new. It actually had to do a lot of callbacks because a lot of the things that it said was a problem. So now let's have an example. So let's illustrate a real world example by talking about a racial biases and facial recognitions softwares or a gender bias in job recruitment algorithms. These algorithms can actually point out very minor things that you may not consider in a job recruitment, right? We talk about sex, we talk about facial recognitions. Certain AI models can be trained to actually negate certain qualities of an individual and ensure that they don't get the job. This is intense. We want to make sure that we stay away from these things, and we want to make sure that we have policies in place so these AI models do not act a certain way. Now we talk about privacy implications of the AI. So let's focus on technologies like facial recognitions and predictive analytics. We'll discuss how these technologies, while offering great benefits in security and personalization services, also it does pose a risk to individual privacy, such as enabling mass surveillance or making highly personal inferences without having the consent of the individual. It is also good to highlight the ethical dilemma of balancing technological advances with the protection of privacy rights. We want to have all this investment in technology, but we don't want to give up all of our rights. So where is that medium? What needs to happen is that there needs to be an AI governance and an ethical framework that is actually happening now, but the progress has been slow. So it is important to develop a comprehensive ethical guideline and regulatory measures to govern AI development and its deployment. These frameworks should ensure that AI systems are accountable for their decisions, transparent in their operations, and design it to prioritize fairness and prevent harm. and prevent biases. So initiatives such as the EU ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI is a great step towards a responsible AI governance. Great. So let's talk about a case, a use case, let's talk about a case studies and ethical dilemma. So some of the case studies that we want to talk about here is the right to be forgotten. So we want to explain that as a legal concept that allows individuals to have their digital records deleted under certain circumstances. So I want to discuss the importance that in this context of privacy and dignity, both becomes a challenge and it possesses a freedom of information and how it's being implemented differently across jurisdictions. So when we think about a right to be forgotten, you can take an example of a certain digital presence that you have that you no longer think it's valuable and you should have the right to delete some data. The biggest topic that we've been talking about now is this sense of digital surveillance. So we discussed how recently that governments and corporations have a certain surveillance initiative. So some of the ethical debates over this is how is this technology used in a private and public place? So we talk about safe space versus a public space, right? And how is this a problem? How is this a potential abuse of privacy and an invasion of privacy? So I also want to talk to you that there's a big importance of oversight and legal safeguards to protect civilians' rights. You can't, I think nowadays that you cannot be recorded without your consent, right? And this is a very big thing because you don't want to just go about your day and then see a video of yourself on social media just going about your day. There are safeguards in place that you can take legal ramifications if a certain right isn't protected. And as we talked about the AI biases, I also want to talk about the algorithmic, I can't even speak, biases that presents especially in different areas, right? So how are algorithms trained to be biased? Again, inherently, these things are not biased. They're not biased. But depending on how it is being trained and how the model is designed, these things can be biased. So it is an ethical responsibilities of ours and developers to ensure fairness and steps needed to mitigate biases within the AI systems, including stuff such as diverse data sets and transparency in the AI decision-making processes. So let's talk about developing a personal ethical framework, right? So ethical decision-making, with this one, let's stress the importance of individuals developing their own framework. So you need to develop your own framework of how you want to have a presence within the digital world. So there are ways to assess the impact of one's actions and others, considering privacy and security as a common good. We know the rule of thumb. You're online, you never want to say something online that you can't read out loud to a crowd of people. Be careful with the words that you choose and think critically about your behavior online, because you may think that when you're young that your digital presence isn't a big deal. But like I said, I have things that is still on the internet from maybe 15 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And that's insane to me. But these are things that maybe I don't have the rights to remove because it could be a certain application that I no longer have access to. So it just lives out in cyberspace. And then we think about the sense of ethical leaderships. So it is important that leaders such as ourselves play a big role in shaping how the ethical implications of technology is being used. So leaders can model responsible behaviors and establish clear guidelines and ethics and create an environment that encourages ethical decision making amongst employees, stakeholders, individuals, families, friends. So there are a lot of dilemmas that leaders face nowadays when it comes to ethical this decision making. So some dilemma that we have here is that some may face that when having such a big data set, who owns this data set, right? How, as a leader of an organization that captures so much data, what do you do that to mitigate any risks, right? And these are hard questions. We don't know. We're trying to figure it out. But there are safeguards that we want to have in place, that we want to make sure that this data is secured in an ethical way. And then I want to touch upon the last point when we talk about ethics, encouraging ethical behavior. As I mentioned, please watch your ethical footprints. It may not seem like a big thing, but trust me, it is. If you give me anybody's first name, last name, I promise I can find as much information as on them as possible. If you want, you can go and Google yourself. You might find your name. You might find people with similar names, but there will be a photo of you. There will be an account of you. If you have a LinkedIn, you have a Facebook, Instagram, MySpace, Twitter, whatever it is, all these old social media platforms, you're out there in cyberspace. So just make sure you have a good ethical way and you have a good ethical footprint. Great. So now let's talk about privacy. We talked about privacy a little bit, but I want to also just talk about certain laws that are in place. So with the global privacy laws, some things I want to know, and I mentioned before, the GDPR as a benchmark for privacy protection worldwide, with its stricter consent requirements and rights for individuals to access, ramify, and erase their data. You'll see sometimes companies can actually, you can actually request companies to get your data. So one thing that it actually does is that it contrasts with the CCPA, which grants Californians consumers the right to know about and opt out for sale of their personal data. As I mentioned before, if you live in California, your data is much more protected. So what happens is Californians are able to actually opt out to having their data being sold and the sale of their own personal information, which highlights the global patchwork for privacy regulations. This diverse reflections has a different cultural understanding for privacy and the challenges of creating a unified global privacy standard. So this compliance, right? So not all businesses actually follow through with what the laws are saying about the privacy is, right? So there is that muddy waters that these companies go through. So some businesses must navigate the complexity of complying with these multiple laws, sometimes conflicting privacy regulations while managing international data transfers. This segment underscores the tension between regulatory compliance and global nature of digital services, illustrating an ongoing struggle to balance privacy with innovation and commerce. And next, we talk about the impact on the individuals and companies. While these laws provide individuals with unprecedented control over their data information, they also imply significant responsibilities to these companies. But there's a dual impact that has to be highlighted here. For individuals, there is a increase in privacy and agency over personal data. For companies, there is a need to invest in robust data governance framework, transparency, and user-centric privacy practices. This discussion should highlight how important it is to have a private, have rights over your privacy and your data. Next, we talk about data collection and use. So there's different methods that companies will collect your data. So some of the methods may be surveys, some may be through cookies, some may be tracking pixels, some are actually monitoring the behavior. So I know within Facebook and Instagram, there is a feedback loop that will count how long that you stayed on a post. So if you pull up your Instagram and you go and look at a post about a cat, in the back end, they're tracking how long you're actually looking at that post. So now it knows that if you spend a good amount of time on a post, that you will like posts like these in the future. This also is implied by the comments, the likes, recommendations that it will have for you. And this is all machine learning generated. If you like a post about a cat, It is known that in a couple posts later, you'll see some more pictures of cats. Your For You page on Instagram is things that you interact with on a daily basis. So if you see something on your For You page that you don't interact with, I would definitely reconsider the things that you've been looking at, because things on your For You page are usually the things that you're interested in. But I'm not here to judge. So we have some challenges of de-identifying and declassifying people's information, because sometimes it's hard to autonomize or anonymize, personal data. While there are some de-identifying key strategies for protecting privacy, the risk of re-identifying um, through data exposure allows individuals' privacies to be breached. So sometimes companies will actually decrypt your data and then recrypt it and decrypt it. And through all of that, your data can be breached at any point in time if the frameworks are not built well enough. And we talked about this in cryptography, in which we'll talk about later on in this course when we talk about cryptography. So there's a need for ethical data to be handled in a good, practical way. And there needs to be practices that allow companies to be very robust about protecting the personal information and aligning with principles of minimal data use and maximal security. So when we talked about surveillance and monitoring, right? There are multiple things that we talk about, right? So there's governments, corporation, and then the ethical considerations of all of this, right? So we talk about what can governments surveil. I can't even speak. What can governments monitor, right? So there is a fine line that governments can monitor when letting you know. As we talked about before, the Snowden revelations illustrates a potential overreach. Did the government really need all of our informations? And what were they doing with this information, right? So I want to stress the importance of the oversight and jurisdiction reviews and public accountability in ensuring that governments do not just go and willy-nilly on our data and our civilians. So what the government did was a breach of our privacy, right? And we need to have safeguards in place so we don't allow it to happen again. But who knows? That's why people have stickers on their cameras. It can be watched at any time. I think that's an overreach, because nowadays in technology, just because you cover your camera with a little sticker doesn't mean that you're perfectly safe, because our mics can be used to be monitored. So, but hey, I recommend the paper on the camera. I do it all the time too. So now we have corporations, civilians. So what happens here is that some companies are allowed to actually record their data, record their individuals, right? So there are certain areas. If you go into your corporate office, there may be cameras in the hallways, in the lobbies, in the elevator, right? This is perfectly fine, right? But now there are some companies that may have it in working areas, right? And there was an illustration that I saw not too long ago of a camera over a barista bar, and it can monitor how fast these baristas were pushing out orders, and it was actually monitoring how long customers stayed and how long they were there in the restaurant. I don't know if this was entirely true video. I don't think so. But it's a great example of what could be the future and what could happen with machine learning. When we think about the ethical consideration, I want to emphasize the need for a balanced approach to having civilians. So we are going to discuss the roles of transparent policy that are clearly communicated to their employees or to individuals. So these practices that have to, they have to be communicated to the users. The importance of obtaining meaningful consent, right? If you want to be monitored, you have to have consent for it. And having the establishment of a robust legal framework that protects individuals from unnecessary and excessive surveillance. So I also want to mention that the ethical obligations of these entities, both of a governmental side and on a corporate side, to respect privacy as a fundamental right, ensuring that surveillance practices are justified, proportionated, and subject to be oversight. If you're being recorded and monitored, you should have the right to see it. If you don't have the right to see it, that we got a problem going on. Then we talk about information security, right? So we talk about what we've been talking about this entire time, the protection of user data. So I want to emphasize that the ethical responsibilities for organizations are to have to secure personal data. So we talked about before as encryptions as transforming data into code to prevent unauthorized users access. And I want to talk about the importance of securing data storage practices. Not everybody can have access to these data, right? If you work in a company, example, I work at Google, I don't have access to anybody's data. And I need to have high clearance to have this access, right? And it should be like that across the board for multiple different organizations. And some impacts that I want to talk about, and I mentioned before about the Target impact, right? There was a data breach within Target that millions and millions of users got impacted. There was data collected on names, debit cards, credit cards, personal information, and this sucks for companies as well, right? How often do you want to hear about your company that you think is so reliable having a data breach? Facebook had a data breach very recently. Mr. Cooper loan insurance, loan mortgage broker, I believe they are. They had a security breach, right? And we're talking about loans of millions of Americans, right? So now you have personal data, social security card, you have data about who they are, where they live, how much they pay, how much they earn. And you can do a lot with that if you're a criminal. Not even a criminal, if you're just a amateur hacker. Because I believe the one for Mr. Cooper was an amateur hacker, right? And this hurts reputations for these companies long term. And then with that, as I mentioned, there's a reason why I have to clarify, right? Because there are some ethical hacking that helps prevent these kind of things from happening, right? So these ethical hackers are called the white hat hackers. I don't know if you heard about them in some of your security classes, but companies they employ them to test the system for vulnerability and in controlled manner, allowing organizations to strengthen their defenses against potential attacks. Former companies that I used to work at had white hackers. They would have people that developed these really robust security systems, and they would hire white hackers to go and just break the system as much as it can. And it did that in a way that allowed the white hackers to identify potential problems, and it allowed the security team to then go in there and fix those problems. And the cycle continues and continues. So this stresses the proactiveness of security testing that is not just a technical necessity, but it's also an ethical obligation to protect user data from potential threats. Very recently, I believe it was I think it was a Chinese company lost about $30 million because of a deep fake, phishing attack. Right, a CEO or I think a CFO asked for some money, and then the company obliged. I don't know. It was with deepfake, you never know. There's so much of it too. I should have added a slide about it, but like this technology that's going on nowadays, especially with deepfake, anybody can be a target. I also want to preface this by saying it is very important to understand this new hack that I've just come to learn about. It's that there are hacks within phone calls. You'll get a random phone call. You'll have somebody not even say anything, but you'll say, hello, hello, how are you? They do that to actually take your voice recording, and now they know what your voice sounds like, and then they can use that for other communications. Maybe a phone call to somebody else, acting as if it was you, asking for some outlandish request. So keep your eyes on that as well. So we already talked about this. I'm not gonna beat a dead horse on this, right? But in the sense that these privacies of these social media companies is very important. There have been so many data breaches. There are just so much happening right now. You never know who owns your data. These companies like Facebook and Twitter and all these other companies have a privacy policy, but you have to have a PhD in law to understand what the hell they're talking about. So please just make sure that whenever you're using any sort of data and any sort of platforms that you understand what is happening. And this is a big concern. So main points on this one, digital literacy is huge. It is your responsibility to also understand how is your data being used and what are the ethical standards of these companies. And it's good to just be educated about these certain things. So emerging technologies and what was coming up in the future. So Internet of Things, there's always something happening. There are always these big things and privacy concerns that will always be there. Data collection will always be there, and how we ethically understand them will always be there. Some big things that we'll talk about later on when we talk about cryptography is some blockchain and quantum computing. If you remember from last time, I talked about quantum computing in the sense that you can use quantum computers to actually break encryptions, and it's intense. So with that being said, just keep an eye out. There are things to come.